Hello historians and welcome back. Today we are going to explore the reign of King Edward VI. Last time we looked at the early life of King Edward while he was prince. Now it's worth mentioning that King Edward VI should technically be King Edward VII or King Edward VI II, as the pretender Lambert Simnel was crowned King Edward VI in Ireland during the reign of King Henry VII, Edward VI II's grandfather. Edward Tudor became King of England upon the death of his father, King Henry VIII, on the 28th of January 1547, and Edward was crowned king at Westminster Abbey on the 20th of February the same year. Prior to her marriage to King Henry VIII, Edward's stepmother and now Queen Dowager Catherine Parr had been romantically involved with Edward's uncle, Sir Thomas Seymour, Lord Sudeley. However, the relationship had to stop when Edward's father, King Henry, had decided he wanted to marry Catherine. Now that Henry was dead, Thomas and Catherine were free to resume their relationship, and by the March, Thomas had proposed to Catherine. The couple would have to seek permission from the Privy Council to wed. However, Thomas knew that the council would be unlikely to approve the match, in case Catherine was pregnant with Henry's child, and then there would be a discrepancy about the baby's paternity. However, Thomas had a good relationship with his nephew, the king, so he thought he would get round it that way. Unfortunately, being the king, getting an audience with Edward would be hard, so Thomas bribed John Fowler, a royal servant, to get the feelers out to see how the young king would feel about Thomas marrying Catherine and what his response might be. According to Fowler, Edward was amazed to learn that his uncle was not yet married, and when Fowler asked the king who he thought his uncle should marry, he suggested Anne of Cleves. He then thought again. "I would he married my sister Mary, to turn her opinions." Edward was a Protestant and did not like the idea that his sister Mary was a Catholic. This was not the answer that Lord Sudeley had wanted.
Pretty obvious.
He was aware that the Privy Council kept Edward short of money. After all, he was a child, and his father had nearly bankrupted the country on several occasions. The next night, Sudeley sent Fowler back to see the king, but this time with gold coins. He got Fowler to ask the king if he should be contented I should marry the queen. Edward was fond of both his uncle and his stepmother, and agreed. Being only 9, he did not understand the political motive behind his uncle's proposal. Meanwhile, the Privy Council were trying to arrange a marriage between Edward and Elizabeth of France, the daughter of the new French king, Henri II. The only issue was that Elizabeth was a Roman Catholic. Uncle Thomas thought that he had a better idea of trying to arrange a marriage between his nephew, the king, and Lady Jane Grey. Jane also had a claim to the English throne. She was the same age as Edward, was named after his mother, Queen Jane, and she was a Protestant. Jane's father, however, was not so keen on the idea and kept Jane at home, away from Lord Sudeley. On the 30th of May 1547, King Edward wrote a letter of congratulations to his stepmother, Dowager Queen Catherine, on her marriage to his uncle Thomas Seymour. This made Catherine England's most married queen, as this was her 4th marriage. Edward was supportive of the match, and in his letter spoke affectionately of the great love Catherine had shown to his father, her goodwill towards himself, and lastly, her godliness and knowledge in learning and the scriptures. He then added, "If there was anything wherein I may do you a kindness, either in word or deed, I will do it willingly." Catherine responded by begging the king to plead her case with the council, which he did at the beginning of June, saying that he had known that his uncle had intended to marry Catherine, and that he had sent a letter signifying his approval To that the king's uncle, Edward Seymour, Lord Protector and Duke of Somerset, could say nothing, and he and the Privy Council were powerless to stop Thomas. It gave the king great pleasure to think that he had helped make a match that made two people that he cared about so happy. Edward wrote to his stepmother when he could, and when he could not, he sent her a message of goodwill, and his uncle Thomas, in return, sent him secret pocket money. Nothing like a bit of bribery to keep the king sweet. Edward's reign also saw the last battle of the Rough Wooing, as Edward himself and the Privy Council had lost interest in Scotland.
I can't go through with it.
You don't see me complaining.
And the Battle of Pinkie Cleugh took place on the 10th of September, 1547. As you may have guessed, England won this battle, so let's talk about it. It was a catastrophic defeat for the Scots. Sorry, Scotland. The English army was led by Lord Protector Somerset against the Scottish for their failure to fulfil their promise to betroth Mary, Queen of Scots, to the now King Edward VI. However, Edward Seymour wasn't that great, as the numpty failed to agree proper peace terms before returning home.
You blew it!
A year later, on the 5th of September 1548, the woman who the king viewed to be his mother, Catherine Parr, died from childbirth complications at Sudeley Castle. 1549 is the year that Edward's tyranny starts. In the January, the first Book of Common Prayer was published to try and establish uniformity of worship for all. All Catholic items such as statues, holy water and stained glass windows were gone. His uncle Thomas Seymour is arrested on the 16th for trying to break into Edward's privy apartments in a desperate act to save his own skin, and was beheaded on the 20th of March. The summer saw Kett's rebellion, where those in the north of England, mainly in Norwich, were revolting as the common land that people used to collect firewood, grow crops and graze cattle was being bought up by the rich, meaning people couldn't afford to feed themselves, and they were becoming disgruntled towards the lords who were buying the land. Robert Kett, a wealthy landowner, sided with the rebels. They stormed the city of Norwich and secured food and weapons in a city that provided them a tactical advantage. With an army of around 12,000, King Edward could no longer ignore the rebellion and sent John Dudley, the Earl of Warwick, with 14,000 troops and mercenaries to squash the rebellion. Kett moved his troops to open ground, which was a terrible idea as this is where Warwick excelled. 250 of the king's men were killed. Edward's army killed 3,000 rebels. His sister, the so-called Bloody Mary, by the way, killed 300 Protestants in her reign, so who was worse? Kett, as the leader of the rebels, was found guilty of treason and executed. Autumn 1549 saw the downfall of the king's other uncle, Edward Seymour, Lord Protector. On the 6th of October, Lord Protector dragged Edward out of bed and took him to the fortified Windsor Castle, as the Privy Council had turned on him for being too liberal with rebels, and his nephew was his only safety net. The two Edwards rode from Hampton Court to Windsor at about 9 o'clock at night and secured the king within the stronghold's walls. The king was outraged by his uncle's actions. He had essentially kidnapped a king. The king had caught a minor cold from the late night journey and exaggerated the symptoms, constantly complaining about the quality of the accommodation at Windsor. Rude. I'll have you know that was one of Queen Elizabeth II's favourite castles, you little snot. Anyway, it was apparently damp and he was bored. Seymour was running low on provisions and the king nearly starved. Seymour eventually lost his nerve and was taken to the Tower, where he was charged with 29 cases of treason. The charges were flimsy, but Seymour had fallen out of favour with his nephew, the king, and his blind panic was his downfall. Edward Seymour, the former Lord Protector, was executed on the 22nd of January 1552. In spring 1550, Charles V sent ambassadors to England to ask the king for a special licence to allow Mary to practice Mass. Edward said no. Charles sent some ships to come get Mary from Essex, but she was unable to escape as English ships had blocked the way. Mary was Edward's legal heir, and therefore she couldn't be touched. but that didn't stop Edward from imprisoning her priests. Mary would later lead a Catholic protest in London on the 18th of March 1551, showing disrespect to her little brother. When his uncle was beheaded at Tower Hill on the 22nd of January 1552, Edward was very cold and heartless about it, writing in his diary, "The Duke of Somerset had his head cut off upon Tower Hill between 8 and 9 o'clock in the morning." He also recorded in his diary that he suffered from a bout of measles and smallpox, which may have damaged his immune system and contributed to his early death. January 1553, Edward falls ill, with a fever and a cough. Worried about the fate of the crown, he wrote his device for the succession. He soon recovered, only to fall victim to measles in the April. These two close bouts of illness had exhausted the king, and his swollen body developed ulcers. Edward's cousin, the Lady Jane Grey, married Lord Guildford Dudley, the son of the Earl of Warwick, and brother to Elizabeth I's favourite, Robert Dudley. They married at Durham Place. Edward was still sick and was unable to attend the wedding, but provided lavish clothes for the wedding. John Dudley, the Earl of Warwick, now the Duke of Northumberland, convinced Edward to make his two sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, illegitimate, and named Dudley's daughter-in-law and Edward's cousin, Jane, as heir. When thinking about the succession, remember Edward was ill for some of it, so he could have been easily manipulated. Edward wanted the country to remain Protestant to continue the Reformation that he had started in his reign. For this, Elizabeth was an obvious choice. She was 19, but Edward viewed her as illegitimate, as her mother Anne Boleyn had been executed for treason, so their father could marry Edward's mother, Jane. Also, like a true Protestant, Edward wanted a male heir and didn't want to leave it to a female. However, all living heirs to the English throne at that time were female. So that's Elizabeth out. Mary was also illegitimate, and even worse, she was a 37-year-old unmarried woman who was Catholic, and she was unlikely to have children. His father's will explicitly skipped over his Scottish family, which left Frances Grey and her children, Jane, Catherine and Mary, all of whom were Protestant. Initially, it was left to Frances Grey, Jane's mum, but it was unlikely Frances would have more children, so it went down to Jane and any male heirs that she may produce, hopefully with John Dudley's son Guildford, which meant that the throne wasn't being given to Jane, only her male children. John Dudley had sacked Edward's doctor for a wise woman who gave the king arsenic. This worsened his condition and made him hysterical. Until Edward added two more words to the document of succession. And her. So it now read as the Lady Jane and her heirs male, putting Jane in the line of succession with or without heirs. It's clear that the handwriting in the document is Edward's, but what is not clear is whose idea it was. Was it Edward's idea, or was he influenced by John Dudley? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section. Dudley then sacked the wise woman and called back the royal doctor, but it was too late. King Edward II died on the 6th of July 1553 and was buried in the Henry VII Lady Chapel at Westminster Abbey on the 8th of August 1553. I hope you enjoyed this look into the reign of King Edward VI. If you did, please like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. But until then, have a wonderful day.